Ms. Yates. Thank you so much for joining us. Excited to have a chance to have a bit of a conversation with you. So you obviously were one of the most high-profile lawyers in our Department of Justice at the end of the Obama administration, the beginning of the Trump administration. I want to dive into this a little bit about how it is that you ended up coming to dedicate your life to the law, because you actually come from a family of lawyers. And if I recall correctly, I think your grandmother was one of the first women to take the bar exam in Georgia. Yet you said at one point that the last thing you wanted to do was to be a lawyer. So what happened and what changed your mind?
Well, first, please call me Sally, and I'm delighted to be here with you today. But you're right. I came from a family where it seemed like everyone was a lawyer. My father, both of my grandfathers, my uncles, my cousins, and even my paternal grandmother. And so I guess it's a reflection of just how nerdy I was, that my idea of being edgy was like not being a lawyer. So you sort of had this idea, I don't want to be a lawyer, I don't want to be married to a lawyer, and I don't want to have a lot of lawyer friends. And now I'm married to one and have lots of lawyer friends. And I worked for a congressman, something you can relate to, and I was on the Hill for a couple of years, and then he retired, and I kind of had to decide at that point what I was going to do. And I realized that I was drawn to policy and drawn to the law, despite my wanting to strike out and be independent. And so I relented, and I was so glad that I did, because when I started law school, you know how sometimes something just clicks? It feels right. I enjoyed law school so much more than I did undergraduate. And so I knew actually from the first weeks that I had made the right decision, and have been glad that I did. So that's so much for rebelling for 2 years.
I was going to say, your idea of rebelling is going to turn into being the acting attorney general for the United States. I guess one thing you need to work on is your act of rebellion.
Yeah.
But
I still got time.
I guess that's true. So I'm curious, as I was reading up a little bit about you in some of the articles that have told a bit of the story of your career. There's been some that highlighted on a case early on in your career as a lawyer that involved a poor elderly Black woman who owned a plot of land, but never trusted our legal system. So she never actually filed the deed. And she almost lost her land and her family's land. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your story, about her story, and how it is that you were able to help her.
Well, actually, it's the most meaningful case that I've ever had for a variety of reasons. As you mentioned, it was the first African American landowners in Bear County, Georgia, which is a rural county outside of Atlanta, and actually where my father was from. And because they were so mistrustful of the white court system, and they had gotten this land in the 1920s, the matriarch of the family actually carried this deed that was written on a piece of cloth, folded up down inside of her dress as she worked the fields every day. That was how important this land was to them. But, fast forward a number of years, it's the late 80s, a developer there is building a subdivision and just essentially took 6 acres of their property from a conflicting survey. And so through a story, I won't go into the details and bore with it, how I came to have this case, ended up using this old theory you may remember from property class called adverse possession, where she and her family had used this property back in the day, washing their clothes in a stream there, and an adjoining neighbor was a witness. But the most remarkable thing about this and why it meant so much is that this was at a time before Batson, the Supreme Court case that prevents you from striking jurors based on race. Before that applied to civil cases. And so the opposing lawyers struck all the African Americans from the jury. And my client and her daughter were literally the only Black people in the courtroom. The jury is all white, everybody, all the witnesses, et cetera. And despite, I mean, I had no idea what I was doing when I was trying this case. I'd never even seen a real trial before. And one of the firm's great patriarchs sat there with me to guide me, Charlie Curbo, who had actually been close with Jimmy Carter. And the jury, despite my novice performance, did the right thing in that case. They felt really good about what they had done and returning the property to her. My client and her daughter had this newfound trust and a court system that they had not, and had very good reason not to have trusted before. So I'm sorry, I'll try to be more shorter answers forward, but walking out of there, you realized this was about a lot more than 6 acres of property. This was about equal justice, and I felt so lucky to be a part of it.
So that is an incredibly powerful story, I think, on a lot of levels. One, obviously, for the narrative that the family went through and the fact that it's a patriarch of that family, and because of her own historical lived experience, she didn't trust our system. The other part, obviously, is that this wasn't all that long ago, right? It's not like this was a case from the turn of the 20th century. This was early on in your career. And so I'm curious, as you had that case early in your career, and as you pointed out, the fact that this deed was written on cloth and tucked inside her, this woman's dress, the distrust that she had for our judicial system because of very real, very much lived experiences, prevented her or prohibited her from actually engaging in it and using the protections of the law that would be there for you or me or and many others, but actually prevented her from taking advantage of those protections because of very valid experiences in our own life. As a lawyer, and then as a public lawyer, how do you confront that challenge, and how do you try to build up trust within a system that for so long has created distrust by large segments of our society, particularly those that are marginalized, poor people of color?
Yeah, Joe, you pointed that is a really significant challenge, and I saw it play out both when I was U.S. Attorney in Atlanta as well as when I was Deputy Attorney General. Just by way of example, in Atlanta, in the northern part of the suburbs, there's a large Latino population and a fair number of people who are undocumented. And they become targets of crime there because many of the people are afraid when they are victimized to raise their hands and to reach out to law enforcement because of what may happen to them from an immigration standpoint. And so, we spent, and actually it was local law enforcement and working with them in Gwinnett a long time trying to communicate with the Latino community there to build trust. And the locals were very good about trying to make it clear to them of, we are not going to turn around and turn you into ICE. If you are a victim of a crime, we really want you to trust us. We want you to report those crimes. We want to protect you. But it took more than saying it. They had to demonstrate that in terms of people there actually seeing that happen. And we had a similar experience in an area of Atlanta, the English Avenue area, a very poor area in the city, drug ridden, just high violence. And it was an area where we were focusing a lot of our work, but they also didn't trust law enforcement. Obviously, African-American community in the South does not have a trusting relationship historically. And so we spent a lot of time working on non-enforcement matters in that community, going into the schools and reading and doing prevention work, doing reentry work in a local church there, and providing services for individuals who are coming out of prison. And I'll never forget standing in the vestibule one day, and there were so many more people there than the number of individuals who had come out of prison, the returning citizens, than we had expected. And I turned to this one man and just introduced myself and sort of asked about him. And he said, well, no, he's not coming out of prison. He lives there in the area, and he had heard that there were prosecutors there who were trying to help people who were coming out of prison. And he just didn't believe that, because he didn't think prosecutors would care about that. So he wanted to come see if that was true. Oh. So, I can't pretend that we changed all the community attitudes, but by not just having it be a one-shot thing, but by sticking with that community and working with them. I do think that we made some inroads in that.
The you might have actually provided the answer to this next question here, but you spent nearly 3 decades at the Department of Justice. You served under both Democratic and Republican administrations. You were actually recommended by officials from both parties. You have earned the trust and respect of officials, including former members of Congress, as diverse from Congressman Trey Gowdy to Congressman Joe Kennedy. So Sally, how do you earn and keep that respect in such partisan times as we are now, but also given the consequence and the heavy weight of the types of cases that you're working on?
Yeah, well, if the Department of Justice is doing its job the right way, it's operating differently than other departments of the government. Yes, it's part of the executive branch, but sort of going back to that trust there for the people of this country to trust that the rule of law is being administered. And the rule of law, when I say that, I mean that the same rules apply to everybody. Nobody's above the law, and we're not using the power of the Justice Department to go after perceived enemies or political foes. For people to have confidence in that, it has to be administered in a partisan blind way. That doesn't mean there aren't changes in policies and an emphasis depending on the administration or the president, and that's perfectly appropriate, but not individual decisions made in cases in a partisan way. And that was sort of how I grew up in the Justice Department. I prosecuted public corruption cases for the most part when I was a line prosecutor, and those are certainly fraught cases. As it turned out, most of the people, not all, but most of the folks that I ended up prosecuting were Democrats, not Republicans, because we prosecuted a lot of local corruption cases because the local DAs couldn't really do them. And I found in our office, it was never an issue. I mean, I didn't even know what the political affiliation was of most of my colleagues. When I was U.S. attorney and was hiring people, I didn't know and didn't care what their political affiliation was. And so I think it's by demonstrating in the small cases and the large that you're making those decisions in an apolitical manner. And look, not everybody's always going to trust that. Even when you are making the decisions that way, sometimes people will ascribe partisan motivations to you. But I think as long as you know in your heart what you're doing is for the right reasons, that you just kind of have to keep your head down and keep going.
Given that answer, given what we've witnessed in recent American history here with an overt effort to, I would argue, politicize the Justice Department to make it more explicit that, in fact, the Attorney General works for the president and is an executive branch employee and serves at the pleasure of the president. What consequence does that have on our judicial system and politically when it comes to our Department of Justice, where, again, not to indicate that civil cases aren't hugely consequential, they are, but when it comes to the question of somebody's own personal liberty, when that ends up being linked to a political outcome or a political persuasion, tell me, just give me your thoughts as to how you think the consequences of that play out.
Yeah, there's nothing that could be more corrosive, I think, to the department. And again, going back to the issue of trust, and it's beyond just the confines of that particular case. I think when we witnessed an attempt to politicize the department, to use it as a weapon, I think that planted the seeds of doubt about all decisions that are made, not just those decisions, not just the high profile ones coming out of Main Justice, but the routine cases coming out of U.S. attorneys' offices. And, I will tell you, I witnessed the efforts from the White House. The career men and women of the Department of Justice, though, that were there during the Obama administration and there during the Trump administration, I think they were really trying to do their jobs. and really trying to call the balls and strikes as they are, but they're doing it under enormous pressure, both from within the department sometimes and from the White House. And the lingering effects of that still exist. And so when FBI agents go knock on someone's door as a witness to try to get information, when jurors are called in for trials and the government is putting on its case, you can't help but expect that some of that is in the back of their minds, that this is not really on the up and up, that there's a different set of rules depending on who you are. And look, we've been struggling as a country to live up to our promise of equal justice from the time of our founding. This, I think, set us back, and it's going to take some work to get that trust back again.
Sally, I was, I started off as a prosecutor for just about two and a half years as a line prosecutor in a local state office here in Massachusetts, which means you just get thrown case after case after case. I remember reading a police report once for the first time as I was in the middle of a trial, asking the police officer what happened next, because I hadn't gotten to that part in a police report yet, which is an interesting experience, right? But one of the lessons that was just hit you very clearly early on from both my superiors in that office and the judges was credibility takes a lifetime to earn, and you can lose it in a second. And that there was no single case that was worth ruining your reputation over, because you could never get it back, which meant on any other successive case, your judgment was going to be questioned. And it struck me as just how hard that was to earn, and how fragile it was, and how on every single appearance before a judge, and certainly before a jury, you had to know how to navigate that. And it was a thing that you had to guard as, here in Massachusetts, a Commonwealth attorney. You had to guard religiously. And I can only imagine that same weight, obviously, being able to step in a courtroom and represent the United States of America, and what that must mean.
It is, but it's the same obligation, whether you're a local prosecutor in Massachusetts or a federal prosecutor in Atlanta, the same obligation. One of the things I used to talk about with AUSAs to try to crystallize it for them when I was U.S. attorney is that to remind them that, and I know this all sounds sort of hokey, but I believe it to my core, that their responsibility was not to win the case. It was not to send somebody to prison. Their responsibility was to seek justice. And that's it. And if you see that as your sole responsibility, then it kind of makes, when you're talking about those decisions you have to make about credibility, and do you get even close to the line? The answer to that is no in all of those, because that's inconsistent with that obligation. And that's not to say there aren't hard calls to make, because there absolutely are. But if you can kind of keep that one obligation in mind, it helps to clarify things, I think.
So couldn't agree with you more, but I think that puts this next chapter for you, obviously, in even greater detail. So if you take us back to early 2017, a Trump administration is now transitioning into office. You were, at that point, I think, the acting attorney general for the United States, after, again, nearly a 30-year career in the Justice Department. As President Trump was taking office, you were then thrust into multiple crises in rapid succession, literally in the span of days. So obviously one that I think is well known is whether to notify a brand new administration about a compromised national security advisor and potentially jeopardize, if you notified the White House, potentially jeopardize a major intelligence and federal law enforcement investigation with regards to Russian interference in the election. And in that, you chose to notify the White House, right, to make that choice as to balance that investigation, and to do that with the requisite precautions, but you had to make a choice, and you chose to notify the White House. Shortly thereafter, you were then confronted with a decision as to whether or not to support a White House immigration policy that was colloquially referred to as a Muslim ban. And you chose publicly that you were not going to defend that policy. That's a heck of a first couple of weeks for a new administration. Walk us through that, because I can't imagine that those choices, well, perhaps maybe they were clear. I can't imagine they were easy.
No, it was an action-packed 10 days, that's for sure. Not what I was expecting. But, with respect to the Mike Flynn situation, that was a tricky situation, in part because we did have, and the FBI had an investigation going on that matter. And normally what you're trying to do, and what I was trying to do there, was to balance the impact it might have on the FBI's investigation, but also with what I felt like was the Trump administration's right to know that they had a national security advisor who was potentially compromised with the Russians, and a vice president who was going out and saying things to the American people that were demonstrably false. And I felt like we should give him the benefit of the doubt that he didn't know that those things were false. And so, there was much back and forth in the days preceding the time that I notified the White House, but reached a point where I felt like the equities, that the FBI had enough time to do what it needed to do at that point, and that the equities weighed in favor of notifying the Trump administration, in large part because I felt like my responsibility in this interim time, when I was acting during the Trump administration, was to treat that administration the same way that I would have if it were the Obama administration. And so I thought about, all right, let's assume this is the Obama administration and we got information about an official there. Would we want to notify the president? Would we want to notify the White House? The answer to that was yes. And so I felt like we should not disadvantage the Trump administration, that our responsibilities to them were the same. Mm-hmm. So we tried to balance it out with the impact it would have on the investigation as well from a timing standpoint, but made the decision to go forward and notify, which, in the first days, it is a tricky scenario, to say the least.
I would imagine it's tricky no matter when, but
yeah.
I would also imagine that that's for a White House counsel that's just literally settling into the office, for an administration that's now settling into the responsibilities of commander-in-chief, obviously, to be confronted with one of your top political aides, one of your top campaign surrogates being compromised by the Russians is less than ideal, I guess, to put it mildly.
Yeah, but I felt like they needed the information so that they could act on it. That it would be wrong of us to have this and not share it with them when they needed, in our view, to take action, but they couldn't do that if they didn't have the information.
And so run us a couple of days later where you, I think, leave Washington, you're down at a dinner, you get notified of a new immigration policy that you were with senior White House officials with earlier that day, no one told you about,
right.
Ends up being controversial, to say the least. I would argue, obviously, illegal. You came to a conclusion that, I'll let you walk us through it, but you also have a new administration that campaigned on a hard line on immigration and a notoriously hardline anti-immigrant former United States Senator, now Attorney General, or designee at that point, hadn't been confirmed. So walk us through those challenges and why you decided that you couldn't defend it.
Yeah, you're right about the timing. It was, I'd had a couple of visits at the White House on the Mike Flynn situation, and we at DOJ learned about this travel ban from reading about it in the media, which, it would be hard for me to overstate right now how outside normal process that is, but particularly because it falls to the Department of Justice to immediately defend when individuals are coming into the country. And I know this feels like a lifetime ago in a lot of ways. This was travel ban 1. They ultimately ended, there were 3 in the administration, but this is travel ban 1 that actually applied to people who had valid visas and were lawful permanent residents, valid green cards in the United States. And folks were literally mid-flight returning to the United States when the president signed this. And so there were lawyers all over the country, DOJ lawyers, who had to respond to challenges when they were then filed when folks landed and couldn't get into the country. And so, as you might imagine, we spent the weekend trying to figure out what the heck this thing was, who was in, who was out, what they were trying to accomplish. There hadn't been, a lot of dialogue here. And this is over the course of the weekend. And then Monday morning, we were notified by one of the judges that she wanted us to tell her what is the Department of Justice position on the constitutionality of the travel ban. So there was no maneuvering here to try to deal with it on procedural issues. This is flat DOJ, what's your position on the constitutionality? And look, we've been reading all the challenges and the cases, and none of this is following like the normal process where usually, 10 layers below me would do pretty memos and they'd analyze everything and it would come up. I'm like on my iPad going in and, LexisNexis doing research, trying to read cases. And so we gathered everybody together, and that includes all the Trump appointees that had responsibility for this, as well as the career people. The one advisor that I could keep during this carryover time. And we started talking through, again, as we had been over the weekend, what are the challenges? What are the defenses? Because certainly the normal thing for DOJ is if there is a reasonable argument that can be made to defend executive action, the department will do that. But what became really clear to me in this discussion is that to defend the travel ban, I was going to have to send DOJ lawyers into court to argue that this travel ban that applied only to Muslim majority countries, that essentially had an exception that favored Christians, that followed numerous declarations from the president of his intent to effectuate a Muslim ban, that this travel ban had absolutely nothing to do with religion. That it was all for national security, nothing to do with religion. And, that was a pretext in my view. It simply was not the truth. And I don't think any lawyer should argue a pretext, but I sure don't think that DOJ lawyers should be doing that, not the Department of Justice. And so at that point, it was really clear to me I wasn't going to be part of this. The harder issue, and there are folks who disagree with me in the position that I took on this, and I respect that, is do you resign in this or do you direct the department not to defend the travel ban? And look, if I'd been the head of the civil division or some other component of DOJ, maybe it would have been satisfactory just to resign. But I was the acting attorney general. I was responsible for the entire department. And the integrity of the department and the individual lawyers that were there. And so it seemed to me like resigning, that protects my personal integrity, but it wasn't doing my job as the acting attorney general. And at the risk of telling you way too long a story here, I will tell you, it was somewhat ironic that there were senators during my confirmation hearing who were all over me about whether I would say no to the president. The president they were talking about then was President Obama, and it was his immigration executive orders. But I remember particularly Jeff Sessions, telling me if he asked you to do something that's unlawful or unconstitutional, or even that would bring dishonor to the Department of Justice, will you say no? And they didn't say, will you resign? They said, will you say no? And I think they were right about that in terms of what my responsibility was. And so that's why I directed the department to defend it.
So you did what you said you would do, and which is what they were insinuating you should do, yet you were criticized for it.
Right. I mean, it was a different president, but it seems to me the principle should be the same, regardless of which one it is. And look, this is, they ultimately abandoned travel ban 1. They took out, those provisions. So I think ultimately they recognized that it wasn't lawful or constitutional either, but they just kept batting until they could get one that could pass constitutional muster.
You mentioned a word repeatedly in that last answer, integrity. What does that word mean to you? And particularly from the perspective, one, of a lawyer, two, as an Attorney General of the United States?
I think I felt like in a lot of ways that, the responsibility to act with integrity applies equally when I was a line assistant United States attorney as it did when I was the acting attorney general. I obviously had different functions then, but the responsibility to be a public servant and to be making decisions based on the fact that you represent the people of the United States is the same. And I guess maybe boiling it down to its essence for me, it's trying to make the right decisions for the right reasons, recognizing that you may not always get it right, that it could be that it's possible a different decision, in retrospect would have been the better one, but trying really hard to have, to be guided by a compass that's pointed in the right direction, to take that responsibility to represent the people of the United States and the principles and the laws and the Constitution seriously, and to make the best decision that you can, guided by those principles, and then to own it, to be willing to accept the consequences of it as well. And to me, it's a responsibility, but my gosh, what a privilege it is too. I feel like the luckiest person in the world to have had a chance to spend 27 years at the Department of Justice in all the positions that I had, and certainly to be able to end my career as Deputy Attorney General and ever so briefly as Acting Attorney General. How lucky am I in that?
Sally, I've had the opportunity to talk to obviously former colleagues and others that are aspiring for office, and the point that I try to come back to, and that is that all of those positions, essentially, we are renting, right? They existed before you, and they're going to exist after you, and you are privileged enough to hold it for a moment in time. And what you want, ideally, from my perspective, to be able to say is that your service there mattered, and that you made a contribution with it. And I think, at least taking it from me, your service there mattered, and you made a huge contribution to it in standing up for that principle at a time when it was the weight of the world literally on your shoulders, and you didn't have to, but we are grateful that you did. Thank you.
Well, it was a privilege.
Given the challenges that you just articulated with particularly minority communities and a Black community, and the deep-seated and structural barriers that have kept oftentimes populations in our country from being able to enjoy that equal justice under law, we are seeing some of the ramifications of that play out this week, literally as we speak, in the trial of Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis. And I know you're not a Justice Department official, but for somebody that dedicated her life to upholding the law and as a prosecutor, how do you view this moment in this trial, and what is it that we as a society need to do to continue that pursuit of those words etched in stone above those doors to the Supreme Court of equal justice under law?
I think this is a critically important point for our country. You're right, the words are etched in stone above the Supreme Court. You go back to our founding documents where we declare all men are created equal, but at the same time we said that, we were enslaving thousands and thousands of African Americans. And so this promise of equal justice has been thus far aspirational in our country. We have not fully lived up to that. And I'm not suggesting to you that justice in this trial means check, we're all done here, but I think it is critically important that there be accountability in this case. It's important in every case, but this is one where we all have literally seen the crime committed on videotape. So we all have seen it over and over again. And when you come down to the value of human life and the disregard for human life that I think many of us saw in that video, that this is a critical moment for us to be able to move forward. I think there's a whole lot more work to do. There are still systemic issues that plague law enforcement, our criminal justice system. There's a lot more work to be done in this, but I think that this case is an important point in that process. And again, there's a lot of work to be done for African American communities, for other communities to have trust in the system. And I am hopeful that if justice is done in this case, that will be a step forward in that direction.
Sally, thank you. You were marvelous. And I obviously could go on listening to this for an awful long time, but I certainly hope that you have opportunities to, and I hope that without infringing too much on a well-deserved time with your family and young grandchildren, that you would have a chance to talk to a lot more, or many young prosecutors. And I was, I think not all that long ago, asked the question of, or somebody that was a journalist that was digging into my own history as a prosecutor, asked one of my superiors if a prosecutor could actually seek justice, which was and could be a fighter for social justice. If somebody that was in a prosecutor's office actually had that ability, which I took, I tried to take not so much as an indictment of me, but as a deep-seated questioning of our system. I think I obviously think the answer to that is unequivocally yes. But I think we need more folks like you that can help articulate that mission and hold our own selves accountable to those values and to those ideals, because that ultimately is what counts, particularly as an element of our government, federal, state, or local. When you have the weight of the United States on your shoulders, or the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, or others, what comes with that is a special level of accountability. But you articulate it beautifully, and I certainly hope to hear more of that in the weeks, months, and years ahead.
Well, as do you. And it's funny, I don't know if you have this reaction. Sometimes people react sort of with surprise that they might consider me somebody who is progressive, but yet I was a prosecutor, and they don't really think that those two things compute. And I think they absolutely compute. If you're doing your job the right way, you can be compassionate and believe in reforming our system and thinking we need alternatives to incarceration and we should not have such draconians. You can believe all of those things, but also believe in accountability and in justice for victims. And those are not inconsistent, but sometimes people get pigeonholed, I think, in terms of what the expected perspective is.
Obviously couldn't agree more. And what I would always say to people that would question that is, look, without question, we obviously need a strong public defender system. You need strong advocates and attorneys to defend somebody's liberty and protection. It's up to the burden of the government to prove that case. But the prosecution is the first mover. The prosecution gets to set the charge. The prosecution sets the terms, essentially, of every single case. And having people in those positions that are able to understand the landscape and not pigeonhole every accused, every defendant, and to try to open that aperture a little bit more, understand perhaps a bit more of the circumstances, ask some questions that perhaps wouldn't get asked, challenge colleagues in your office, law enforcement, others, oftentimes can actually go a long way to correcting some of that imbalance than even the most dogged defense attorney, just given the nature and the structures of the system.
You're absolutely, I will never forget. You're absolutely right. A young AUSA, when I was U.S. attorney, telling me she'd only been in the office a little less than 2 years. And she came to my office and said she just had to leave. That she said sentencings are just too hard. I look at the family of the defendants behind them and children and wives and think about the impact this is going to have on their lives with their loved one being sent away. And I told her, actually, the day she needs to leave is the day that a sentencing is not hard. Because as much as you believe in accountability and that this sentence is just and fair, you can't help but obviously feel compassion for the family members who are impacted by this as well. And so when people lose the humanity, that's when they ought to get out of the prosecutor.
Agreed.
So she stayed.
Good for you. The next Sally Yates, here we come. Sally, thank you so much. I'm grateful for your time, as always. And Trey Gowdy does say hello.
Oh, tell Trey hello. Yeah.